Salvete. Now that we've talked a lot about the indicative, active, and passive systems, I just want to talk a little bit about reference materials. You can use your own papers that we've done together as a reference material. That's just fine. But you can also use books. All grammatical grammars and grammatical appendixes to Latin books have these tables in them. And being able to access them and use them is very helpful. So I'm looking in the Cambridge Latin course, Unit 4 here. This is going to have the most verb forms. And if you turn to the page on regular verbs, 305, you're going to see that it has all those verbs that we just looked at together. I'll zoom in a little bit. Notice this is the indicative, and this is the active, and then here are all the conjugations. They got the IOs also, and the fourth conjugation. And then they have all the tenses, present. So here you got porto, portas, portat, portamus, portatus, portant, most, mustis, sunt. You got it in every conjugation there. You got the imperfect with all the bas. You got the future. They put all these together because those are all the present stem. Okay. Then you got the perfect. And it'll continue to the next page for the other two tenses, which are pluperfect and future perfect. And there they all are, easy for you to reference, and they're in that order that is the normal order. It's also got the passives. So here you can see all the passives. There's the present system passives, present, imperfect, and future. And then also all the perfect system passives that we just went through on the page. So I did it in a kind of a chronological layout so you can kind of see it, but here they all are, very easy to reference. Got some notes in there of historical present. Also, you're going to notice they talk a little bit about some irregular forms. In Virgil, this is really common. Often portaverunt, since it doesn't scan well in poetry, is written portavere. So this, except that's a different form for erunt is ere. That can be confusing sometimes because it looks a little bit like an infinitive, but see, it has the perfect tense marker, the V, in there. So that makes it a little different. Okay. Let's see here. What else? Some stuff we want to talk about. Then they have the subjunctive, which we haven't talked about yet, but we'll get into that soon. It's in there too. They also are going to have the passive subjunctive, and then some other forms. We just have looked at some of these. There's the imperative down there. Here's the infinitive forms they have. There actually are three infinitives. There's the present infinitive, which you're most used to seeing, which is the second principal part, which means to carry, to teach, to drag, to capture, and to hear. There's also a passive infinitive, and the way you make the passive infinitive is you just change that last E to an I. So this means to carry, portare, but portari means to be carried. It's the passive form of the infinitive, and it works the same way. You change to an I. Notice for trahere, since that E is weak, it changes to an I, and the ER drops out. So it's trahi. Ducere would be duki. Dicere would be diki. Okay, so it works like that. There's also a perfect active infinitive, which uses isse, portavisse, which means to have carried. We'll talk a little more about that later. There's a perfect passive infinitive, which uses the perfect passive participle, or the fourth principal part, and then esse, portatus esse, to have been carried. And there's a future active infinitive. And we haven't talked a lot about the future active yet, but we'll get into that. Portaturus esse, the ur makes it a future. And we will talk about that some later. Here's the imperative that I just talked about a little bit ago. Porta and portate, doce and docete. And then we'll get into this talk about participles a little later. So I just want you to be aware that all this stuff is in the back of the book. And it's also in your, here's some stuff on gerunds, which we're going to get into later too. One thing I do want to talk about before we get into the subjunctive is I want to talk a little bit about deponent verbs. And rather than do all the writing out again, I'm just going to talk about it here. A deponent verb is, let me use a little notes here. A deponent verb is kind of a special case. Okay, it's kind of a mixture of active and passive stuff going on. So deponent verb, they're very common and they're frequently used. Loquitur, which means he talks, is a deponent verb. Okay, now what does it mean if it's a deponent? Well, what it means is it has a tur, which is a passive ending. So the form of this verb here is passive. But he talks is an active meaning. Okay, he talks. So the meaning of the verb, although the form is passive, loquitur, it's not loquit, okay? It's loquitur. The meaning is active. These are words that have set aside their active forms, and they only have passive forms left. But those passive forms are active in meaning. I know it's kind of confusing. That's why depono means I put down, I put aside. They've put aside all their active forms. There is no loquit. There's just a loquitur. And it always is active in meaning. Okay, it's never passive in meaning, it's active in meaning, even though it's passive in its form. You would think it's passive, but it's not. So when these verbs appear in the dictionary, they look a little different. Whereas a normal verb would look ambulo, ambulare, I'll write one out, ambulo. This is a regular verb, not a deponent. Ambulare, ambulavi, ambulatus, walk. Okay, sorry, I'm losing it there. A deponent would look like this. It would be loquor, that's the first person singular present, I speak, and then loqui, which is a passive infinitive, but it's active in meaning, to speak. And then there is no perfect active form for a deponent, so you just leave this next form out, and then locutus, having spoken, okay, locutus. And if you want to say I spoke, it'd be locutus sum, so some dictionaries put that sum in there, and that just means to speak. So the way that you can tell if a verb is deponent is if it has these forms. If it ends in, the first one ends in an R instead of an O, it's passive. If the second one is in passive infinitive, loqui, it's not loquere, it's loqui. And if it's missing this form here, and then it has the participle form, this adjective form lastly, that's a deponent. Now when you're looking at a deponent, it's going to look just like a regular verb in the passive. It's not going to have any active meanings, but all these forms are passive in are active in meaning, even though they're passive in form. So conor, I try, it's going to be conor, conaris, conatur, and then the imperfect. It's got all the passive forms, but these are all active in meaning. Vereor, I am afraid. Loquor, I speak. Ingredior, I enter. Orior, I rise. And so you can see here they always have passive endings, but all these verbs are active in meaning. In another video, I'll talk about some of those important deponents that you should know for Virgil and Caesar, because there's a pretty good list of them that you should know and be aware of when they pop up. Walete.